In Flanders Field, the poppies blow. The poppies blow between the crosses.
When I look at the people that I'm helping, Mark Campbell, others who have sustained serious injuries, lost his legs, internal injuries, brainstem injury, complex PTSD, and the reality, he is not being treated at the same standard that I am as a peacekeeper. And as an advocate, that's always been our foundation. You know, there must be equality and recognition, national sacrifice.
Two of the captains that fly the snowbirds were women. Woo. All right, come on. And if that isn't an advance, I don't know what is. It's really great, it's symbolic, and we've got to accommodate the whole business of women in our forces.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Marissa Semkiw. In the peak of this tower is a small room. In the center of this room are 7 books. They're called the Books of Remembrance. In these books are written the names of every Canadian who has died fighting for our country, Canada. There are 118,000 names. Each day, at 11 o'clock, a page is turned. When he dedicated the Peace Tower in 1917, Prime Minister Robert Borden said, "The tower will be a memorial to the debt of our forefathers and to the valor of those Canadians who, in the Great War, fought for the liberties of Canada, of the Empire, and of humanity. Today, we honor all who have served."
In Flanders Field, the poppies blow. The poppies blow between the crosses.
Flanders Field, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row.
Row on row that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly.
We are the dead. Short days ago we lived. Felt dawn, saw sunset glow. Loved and heard.
Scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived. Felt dawn.
Take up our quarrel with our foe. To you, from failing hands we throw the door.
Saw sunset glow, loved, and were loved.
If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sing of his road.
No, we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high.
We shall not sleep, for shall shine Flanders Field.
If ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow on Flanders Field.
Welcome to our Remembrance Day Special. I'm pleased to welcome to the roundtable and in our studio audience several Canadian Armed Forces veterans as well as current serving members. Thank you all for your service and thank you for being here. That was the premiere performance of a new musical rendition of In Flanders Fields, composed by Marilyn Lightstone and arranged by David Warwick. The poem, sung for us by the Canadian Men's Chorus, was written by Dr. John McCrae during some of the bitterest fighting of the First World War. We Canadians, who know this poem well, are a peace-loving people. So over time, it has been reduced to a requiem for the dead, ignoring the final message of the last verse, an unabashed command to keep our military strong. If ye break faith with us who die, it says, we shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. Now, Lieutenant General Rohmer, do you agree that In Flanders Fields is not only a lament for the dead, but also a plea from the fallen to honor the soldiers of today?
I think that's a very fundamental part of what McCrae's mind was thinking when he wrote those fantastic words. I've been to the place where he wrote them, and it's quite impressive even now, after all of these years, as to the atmosphere at the time. It was a very bloody time for him and what he was involved in. And he didn't know that he was going to be taken up and sent to heaven. And he has given us words that are, in effect, priceless in terms of understanding the issues that face people who are in combat. I'm a combat person, and I understand fully what he had to say.
Priceless and also timeless. Do you agree, Sergeant Anthony? There's a timelessness about this poem.
Absolutely. You know, when you hear the poem, and every Canadian knows this poem so well, they are able to reflect over, you know, the loss and sacrifice of all the Canadians who have served overseas. And it's really important to remember that loss and take that time to honor all those serving members and their memory and their legacy.
Did hearing the poem read or sung to a slow march illuminate it in any way for you? It's meant to sort of contrast to that sing-song way we're taught in schools.
I think this poem, frankly, is a national symbol that we should be embracing in modern terms. I think Canadians must understand that this nation has been to war, the longest war in our history, and that we have broken faith. We have veterans who are protesting the incapable care. We have homeless veterans of my age and of a new generation who are experiencing the very same horror that was written in the beginning of that poem. It may have been on a different battlefield, but the mental trauma, the physical trauma that Canadians suffered. You know, we tend to listen to Flanders Fields on Remembrance Day. You know, we try to instill that spirit on our children and today's generation. But I don't think that we as a nation are standing up to the spirit of that poem.
Alex, what do you think about that? Do you think that we're standing up to the spirit of the poem?
I think we're standing up very well to it. I thought we have a lot of people around the country that like to support the troops and the veterans. I've seen many of them want to support. I don't see any negative about it at all. It's all positive, trying to support the veterans in the past.
One thing I was struck by is that in the First World War, 40% of the male population between the ages of 18 and 45 served. In the Second World War, and nearly every one of them volunteered. My husband's grandfather, he was 16. He lied so he could join the Canadian Armed Forces. Do you think that today we have that same sense of duty among the young to be part of it as we did back then?
I don't think so. As a mother of three 20 to 30-year-olds, I don't think that same passion for for country. Maybe it exists in a different way in that generation, and we need to harness that. I'm sure it's there. They're a very passionate generation, but they're not showing it in the same way as previous generations.
I think the recruiting numbers speak for themselves. Right now, Department of National Defence is having a very difficult time recruiting young Canadians, Canada's sons and daughters, to step forth. And this must be reflective in the pain and suffering in our national spirit that has been occurring over the past several years. Do we recognize Remembrance Day? Do we step forth as a family where General Rohmer and myself can bring our kids and family to the cenotaph and experience the true sacrifice that has occurred? No, we don't. And unless we stand forth on our cenotaphs as a community with community spirit, we're going to suffer the consequences in recruitment. There are many issues at play here where we as a nation can definitively help.
And we will get into some of those issues on the other side of the break. When we come back, our panelists reflect on what Remembrance Day means to them, and are Canadians doing enough to honor the sacrifices of our veterans? We'll discuss.
It is heartwarming to see the veterans wake up on Remembrance Day and look out the window and see 30,000 Canadian flags planted by Canadians in recognition of their service.
Welcome back. On November 11th, 100 years ago, the First World War came to an end. Canada's contribution was significant and costly. A nation of not yet 8 million fielded a fighting force of more than 620,000. Over 66,000 gave their lives and more than 172,000 were wounded. The country came out proud and victorious, and its accomplishments earned it a profound respect and recognition, both at home and abroad. Now, Doug, a lot of people don't know that you work with the Salvation Army. A lot of people don't know that the Salvation Army actually goes to war with our military.
That's correct. We started right here in Toronto, as a matter of fact. In 1938, the Salvation Army signed an agreement with the Canadian government to set up welfare offices and canteens. The first one was at the Exhibition Park, just down the road. And shortly after that, in those days, Camp Borden, now Base Borden, they were the first two. And from then it expanded to wherever there was enlistment, wherever there was a conflict, wherever there was a training base, Salvation Army set up. Recreation centers became a part of a welfare fabric, added chaplaincy services to that. Mobile canteens, even today, following the troops as they go on gun camps, fall exercises, those type of things, and have been a support system overseas to bring home to the soldiers, really what it was all about.
Alex, a World War II veteran as well. What does Remembrance Day mean to you? What do you reflect on?
The Remembrance Day remembered. I remember the people who died, some of the ones. When I was growing up, as a teenager, the war had just started, and most of us didn't know what was really going on. But, most of the older boys in the area all joined up. They had that urge because of the urge to help their country and to fight the problem. And there was lots of propaganda. So the people got that feel that they had to help. So I joined the Air Force. And at 18 at the time, I was off to St. John, New Brunswick, never been away from further than Stouffville in my whole life. And so it was quite an experience to just get in the train by yourself and go hundreds of miles away.
Thank you for sharing that. We hear these stories. Are Canadians doing enough to acknowledge the sacrifices that our veterans have made and that our men and women in uniform today are making? On Remembrance Day, we often wear poppies, we'll attend ceremonies, we'll visit memorials, but should we be doing more throughout the year?
It's interesting you should say that because I've been part of a Remembrance Day service now at Fort York National Historic Site that really began in 1952, right after the Korean War. And I have watched our attendance at that event rise exponentially every year. So we have our remembrance ceremony service, the fort's open, we have sponsors and food. Because we're an historic site and a museum and public history is what we do, and what we like to say is every day is Remembrance Day at Fort York. National Historic Site, and we make sure that there's a tableau there of people in uniform from the War of 1812 right through to the Second World War, and you would not believe the number of people who flock to all these troops dressed in period uniforms for photographs and for selfies and for all those things that current and modern people do. Our local schools attend now, and it's I feel there's a change. And I was a little bit down about 10 years ago because there were reports that numbers were dwindling. And you hear that discussion, you know, particularly sometimes amongst youth, well, how can I remember that which I didn't experience? But you forget that you're remembering as a nation.
I'd just like to chip on what you said there. And this is the problem when we have provinces that don't honor our veterans as a national holiday, because we have to resort to sending our kids to the fort or to under someone else's care. And personally, I find that egregious.
So you think we should be doing more?
Well, I think their mother and father should be there. And I think their mother and father should be talking about their forefathers who did serve in World War II. And therefore, you know, because that's where we're losing it. They have no self of identity on a family level because we've failed at a family level to ensure that that memory, that honor, that legend's perpetuated. And you know, there's only one time of the year where that comes forth, and that's on Remembrance Day.
Jocelyn, final word.
Yeah, so the veterans at the Veterans Center, Remembrance Day is every day. November 11th is extremely special to them. And we now have a Raise a Flag campaign, and this will be its 8th year, and it's a very special year. And I can tell you, it is heartwarming to see the veterans wake up on Remembrance Day and look out the window and see 30,000 Canadian flags planted by Canadians in recognition of their service. This year, at the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, we have 475 Canadian veterans at the Sunnybrook Veterans Center. We want to have 47,500 flags, 100 flags for every veteran in the Veterans Center. So please help us raise a flag.
Okay, now, after the break, are Canada's armed forces hitting their diversity goals? That's next.
Predominantly, the military has always been a male-dominated organization, but it really should reflect the public and the diversity of Canada.
Welcome back. Canada's military is ramping up efforts to get more women, Indigenous people, and visible minorities into uniform in order to better reflect the diversity of Canada. Currently, 15% of members are women, 7.2% are visible minorities, and 2.8% are Indigenous Canadians. The goal is that by 2026, 25% will be women, that's 1 in 4, 11.8% visible minorities, and 3.5% Indigenous Canadians. Now, Sergeant Anthony, I'll go to you first. Why is it important for the government to set these targets? Or is it important?
I do think the government is setting a higher standard than what's expected, especially when it's predominantly the military has always been a male-dominated organization, but it really should reflect the public and the diversity of Canada. I found it interesting that you were reading off all those remarks, female, minority, Indigenous, and I make all of those points, like I'm half Chinese, I'm a female, I grew up in this city, and my grandmother was Native, and so the reflection of that is really how do we make sure that people and women, specifically in diverse cultures, feel that they're welcomed, and absolutely they are. It's very difficult, especially for women, to join because they have family obligations and careers like everyone else. But we have a lot of programs that are ongoing specifically towards women, so they know that it is, a possibility.
Someone might ask, why not just the most willing and the most qualified? Why specifically seek out different groups? General Rohmer.
I attended a meeting of the Snowbirds and dinner in a northern town this spring. And I was photographed with the Snowbirds, the pilots, and all the ground crew, beautifully dressed and formal. And they had done a big show. And I was absolutely pleased to note that among the pilots that I was photographed with, I'm right in the center, and of the pilots, 2 of the captains that fly the Snowbirds were women.
Woo!
All right, come on. And if that isn't an advance, I don't know what is. It's really great, it's symbolic, and we've got to accommodate the whole business of women in our forces.
How do you think it's changed? I mean, over the years.
I don't believe in quotas, first of all. I believe that if we have a rigorous recruiting standards, that we wouldn't have to set quotas. There'd be just that amount of women, Aboriginals, and other targeted groups coming forward because the spirit of the nation has been instilled in them. Not because we have a dedicated effort, oh, we can make you a cook or something like this, I'll give you a career. No. You know, and I think that that's where the change has to come. And on DND level, to their credit, and I say this to General Vance if you're listening, because there has been a significant inroads on military sexual assault, other issues that have been problematic over time. And that once these issues are sorted out, you know, your best recruiter is the soldier. When you go home, or when your dad went home, he recruited you, for God's sakes. You didn't know it, but the process had started.
Oh, he did not, but...
But the process had started because you had been exposed to that military spirit and perhaps that spirit of a nation that you want to embrace. And, you know, I mean, if you step forward, then you don't have to worry about quotas.
I think it's symptomatic of us as Canadians. We're polite, we're comfortable. But I think if there was a conflict, if there was a need, the heart of a Canadian would come out and we would enlist. I don't think our numbers are down because Canadians don't care per se, regardless of what sector they come from. I think it's simply because at this point, there really doesn't seem to be a perceived need that we need to increase our military. But I think just as our sports team put a Canadian team on, everybody rallies around. And I think if a call went out, Canadians would sign up.
But I think to really increase women and visible minorities, we need prominent and showcased role models from those sectors. It's the same as women in other leadership roles. There are many barriers, and I think we need to reduce those, find out what they are, reduce them, and really promote this as a career for women and for people in visible minorities.
Well, can you speak to some of those barriers, Sergeant Anthony?
Absolutely. So every year we do celebrate Women's Day, and we do bring in a slew of talented, amazing women who've succeeded in their careers, such as one of the CEOs from the Snowbirds who came in and spoke one year, and the ombudsman from Toronto. And they spoke of some of their challenges that they have faced, these women warriors who today, you know, experience having a career and a family. So I think that's important to understand that, you know, not just as a woman, but they have their family to take care of, and ensuring that we are bringing to the table a respectable career that everybody can participate in a safe and healthy environment.
All right, well, when we come back, are Canada's veterans getting the support they need and deserve? That's next.
When we deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, or whatever mental malady that will come forth due to experience of combat, could be hyperanxiety, depression, there's a long list there. We know now there's no excuse for us not to treat our young veterans when they come forward.
When I was having suicide idea, I had a plan. I even had the letters written for my loved one. And I did 2 real attempts where I actually end up in the hospital. No one from my unit came to pick me up, came to, or called or anything. I stayed in the hospital alone. When I arrived back to my unit, no one was aware that I was at the hospital. No one told them. I was in so much pain, waking up from those nightmares. I was in, when you're in so much pain that it becomes physical, that you can feel here that it's, I guess people do not understand when we are into that mental state. We are in so much pain that all we see, it's so much dark that we feel like we are a burden, not only to our loved one, but to the entire world.
On Remembrance Day, we also remember and hold in our hearts the unknown number of military members who have been wounded in mind and spirit and have suffered for years or their whole lives. Dr. Charles, we know that one thing many soldiers suffer from when they return from war is post-traumatic stress disorder. What are some of the physical and mental symptoms of PTSD?
Well, we have an interesting experience with that in the Veterans Center because it wasn't a diagnosis when the veterans we care for finished their service. So much of it was hidden, and it's interesting in the work that I've done with veterans with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. We were seeing an increase in some of the behaviors related to dementia, and what we uncovered was that a lot of this was post-traumatic stress disorder that had never been diagnosed, and it wasn't until their Alzheimer's disease or other dementia caused them to lose the ability to cover up and to cope with it that we were seeing some of these symptoms. So things like nightmares, flashbacks, things that staff would do that could be a trigger for some of those symptoms. And so we actually taught our staff what some of those triggers were so that they could avoid that. So things like speaking in their native language, if they were from another country, we told them you have to speak in English. Things like lining up for meals if they were a POW survivor, certain noises, certain smells. So we actually took a really close look at the care that we were providing to make sure that we reduced those triggers. We became much more aware, and we were able to get the veterans who had those symptoms the care that they needed.
One of the things I found interesting is I read on Stats Canada that 1 in 10 veterans coming back from the Afghanistan war suffer from PTSD, which is twice the rate of non-Afghan veterans. And I'm curious if that's fair or if we're just diagnosing it better.
Sounds like a statistic. And in Canada, statistics are at the root of all of our progress and evils. Two things combined. So I can't really relate to it. It's not any of my experience, but in any event, it's a reality.
Were you around men and women that suffered from, I guess back in World War II, it was called something else?
Well, it was called something else, but we didn't have very many people at all, in terms of not being able to perform, not being able to perform in the face of the enemy. We had no visible people that had that kind of problem. So all this PTSD and other things are new in terms of the actual combat existence from World War II on. It's something new that I did not experience.
I think it always existed. We just didn't have a term for it,
no
right?
question.
You know, and then, you know, historically during the Vietnam War, that's where the term originated, when American veterans were coming back and suffering, you know, its problems back at home. And in reference to your statistics, I find them very interesting because during that period of time, you know, Canada was involved in combat since the first time since Korea, where we lost 516 people. I mean, in my era, it was peacekeeping. Yes, we deployed, and I'm proud of all my fellow veterans of the Cold War, for example, or peacekeeping, because, you know, we did keep the enemy at bay for many years in Germany, in NATO, and it was a reason that there's peace in Canada, but also in our allied nations. But when we deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, or whatever mental malady that will come forth due to experience of combat, could be hyperanxiety, depression. There's a long list there. We know now there's no excuse for us not to treat our young veterans when they come forward. And this is
we?
where I go, just one more point, because this is important, you know, to the department's credit, they have been doing substantial efforts on this issue. You know, we have fought for help for the spouse. We have fought for professional help for the children, in addition to that. These are important measures that directly reflect our growing awareness of how the impact that mental trauma has borne on Canada's sons and daughters in war. Not peace, but in war.
Every veteran who fights overseas expects that when they return, they will be treated well and that the country will recognize what they've done in terms of being exposed to death in combat and will be treated well when they return. Do you think that that's happening? I'll put that to the table.
I think there are many issues at play here.
But I think it may also depend on the age of the veteran. My dad, for example, was a Second World War veteran, but really didn't need, or in his mind, and I think in his mind, didn't need any type of help or assistance till he was in his 90s, and then began to look at Veterans Affairs, what benefits do I have? But earlier, as long as he was able to work, he was fine. So maybe there is a gap in service because of the health and the condition of the individual.
It's important to note that you may serve, but you may not go to war. I mean, it's just reality. You know, it's pyramidal in shape. Combat arms are up front, and there are many supportive elements for the actual engagement of trauma. So when we use a big number, so, oh, well, X amount of deployed, but only 10% are coming forward with PTSD. Well, those were the people, majority, not all the time. There's accidents and bad things happens all around, but primarily it happens when you're in combat. And, you know, when I look at the people that I'm helping, Mark Campbell, others who have sustained serious injuries, lost his legs, internal injuries, brainstem injury, complex PTSD, and the reality, he is not being treated at the same standard that I am as a peacekeeper. And as an advocate, that's always been our foundation. You know, there must be equality and recognition of national sacrifice. The standard was set by General Rohmer, those who saw it in Korea, myself and others until 2006. And at that point in time, we dropped the torch.
When I served overseas, there were quite a few incidences, particularly that happened when I was serving in Kabul, Afghanistan, that vividly I remember all the time. I have a great group of friends I can rely on and discuss these things with because these are the people that I served with, I trust, who have experienced these incidences with me. A lot of people who have served overseas, they come back scarred. I'm not going to deny that we can't do better on a whole for veterans, but if they're active, they need to speak out and ask for help. I can't help them any more than they can help themselves for the friends and comrades that I do know served overseas. But there has to be a system in place to ensure that these people aren't lost. And as a serving member, there are numbers we can call, there are people to help. But once they're out of the forces, once they're carrying on with their lives, their careers, and their families, they're relying on government assistance and systems in place to help them.
Okay, well, there's more to come after the break. Stay tuned.
I didn't serve overseas, but our grandson did in Afghanistan. As he said, you didn't know who your enemy was. And as a result, the post-traumatic stress really affected a lot of the young soldiers.
Welcome back. It's time to take questions from our audience, so we'll jump right in. Sir, what's your name? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what's your question?
Good afternoon. Retired Major Stu Chapman. I didn't serve overseas, but our grandson did in Afghanistan. And the one thing that we learned from him when he came back was that the soldiers serving in Afghanistan was totally different than it was in the Second World War or Korea, in that, as he said, you didn't know who your enemy was. And as a result, the post-traumatic stress really affected a lot of the young soldiers in the Afghanistan theater. In any event, when he came back, along with a number of other soldiers, and these boys were from the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, they didn't get the job counseling support that perhaps they could have. So it would be nice to see, we fight strife now in a different way, and it does affect the soldiers coming back.
I think there's been significant improvements on the reserve level, because for a while there, you were right. And I have helped people in the Rileys that, what do I do? I'm here, I'm hurting. There was no real support on the base except go to the chaplain, and many are not orientated in that way. And over time, after a suicide and after dedicated reform on behalf of General Vance to make the JPSUs more inclusive of our reserve units, because it was, I thought, a crime, frankly, to bring civilian soldiers in, train them up, bring them in, immerse them in combat, you know, where you are hyper-vigilant hour after hour, day after day. You're watching things happen, you know, and then you come home after 7 months of adrenaline and visuals, as noted, right? You know, but there's no one to go to. And you know, I think that there have been changes, but as we move forward, there needs to be more.
When members do come back from overseas, there is policy in place. There's a checklist for them to follow through. So they do check in with their chain of command, they do come in for 2 days, and they do follow up with healthcare and social workers and padres.
Thank you, sir. Stay right there. We'll be right back with some final thoughts.
Jean from Toronto says, I think it's important to remind the younger generation what the meaning of Remembrance Day is, because as time goes on, more and more people forget that people fought and died for our freedom. Dave from Mississauga comments, I never forget Remembrance Day. I've had friends and family that fought in the war, and I feel it is the honourable thing to remember their sacrifices. Keep the tweets and Facebook comments coming in. And don't forget to log on to www.thezoomertv.com for full episodes and more.
Welcome back. Our panelists will leave you now with some final thoughts, starting to my left.
I find it very important on Remembrance Day to remember not only all the soldiers and men and women who sacrifice so much so that we can live in peace, but to remember the veterans and the serving members who are currently serving, and to remember to support their families. We have to remember their legacy moving forward and maintain their memory.
I can tell you that at Fort York National Historic Site in the City of Toronto remains committed to public history programming and commemorative events, Remembrance Days events, as ways to bring into the 21st century what remembrance means so that it continues. I think it's part of our national culture and fabric to keep this going, and we're going to do it at Fort York, I can tell you that.
So I'm hoping that every Canadian that watches this show gathers their family together this year on Remembrance Day. It's a Sunday. There's no excuses. To step forward, you know, on the 11th hour, the 11th minute, to be with your community, you know, and after the parade's over, if there's someone in uniform there or a veteran wearing, just do a simple courtesy of walking up, shaking their hand, and thank you for your service, because many feel that they haven't been thanked.
I think it's important to remember this Remembrance Day, particularly because we're in turmoil in this world today, and we really don't know what's going to happen. But the young people should be told what happened to the previous generation if you didn't pay attention to what's going on. And I think it's very important for the young people to be aware of what can happen if they don't pay attention properly to what's happening in politics and things. And I think that we have to look after the new people that they're getting injured today, because we need to have the proper facilities for them, as well as look after the older ones that are still hanging on in the end. Thank you.
I think what we need to do is to put action to our remembrance and to our thanks. I don't think we can separate the two. Thanksgiving for what we have, what people have done on our behalf, where we can go from here. And I think we need to put legs onto our belief and to our faith so that what happens in the future, we're thankful for what price has been paid, thankful for what we have presently.
Thank you, Marissa. It's been great, and it's so encouraging to see this growing interest in our veterans and our troops here in Canada. But we have to keep the momentum going. We have to continue to thank our veterans and recognize the incredible sacrifice they made. So please help us raise a flag, and please help us to keep this voice and this message going.
We should all thank Moses for the opportunity to have this kind of program, which is so influential and very, very important. I wanted to say that the young man who blew the bugle did a wonderful job for us today. Very, very well done. No glitches, whatever. And so we're grateful to him for blowing the bugle. And that gave an atmosphere to this program. And I want to thank the hostess who did so very well for us as well. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you to my panelists for this engaging discussion. Thank you to the rest of our audience for being here. That's all the time we have. We'll see you soon. For now, it's time to zoom out.